Hey, this is Ben Lopatin with Welfare Interactive again, and I wanted to just chat a little bit today about tests and how tests, or the lack thereof, can make it difficult to make changes to your existing Django site. I previously mentioned, and I have before, how I say there are four flavors of tests. There are great tests, no tests, bad tests, and slow tests. Sometimes I describe it in a different order. But just having tests isn't always enough, and sometimes the tests you have can be worse than no tests at all. And so I want to dive into these reasons and these reasons why it can be difficult to work on a site because of these tests, and some of the strategies we can take to ameliorate these issues, to solve the problem, if you will. Great tests are tests that are probably fast, hopefully, or as close to as fast as they can be, that have extensive coverage and test in sufficient depth the code, your code base, and the logic in it. No tests, descriptively it's pretty obvious. It means there are no tests. It could also mean you have a few or some really trivial tests. I've seen code bases where developers left in those default test stubs that Django adds when you create a new app with the management command, the start app management command. Yeah, that means you have tests, but they're trivial, and this falls into the no test category. When you have no tests, or you have these trivial tests, or really just maybe a few good tests, but no coverage at all, what this means is it's really difficult to make changes with confidence to other parts of your application, to your Django site. You're going to be testing in production. You're going to hopefully have some sort of great exception handling service or logging to see if there are errors, but that's the way you're going to be testing. If in fact the result you're looking for are exceptions, and they may just be the wrong decision being made. So no tests are bad. We're going to get to how you deal with this in a minute. Slow tests, I want to describe these first. Slow tests are just, they're dog slow. This could be, and this is a relative term, but usually this means that it's a meaningful time period to run a test suite that maybe isn't that big. So if you've got a test suite that's under 1,000 tests, and it's taking even a couple of minutes to run, that might seem like a long time, and that can be, especially if they're unit tests. But chances are we're talking more than a few minutes. We could be talking 10 minutes, half an hour. Now we're getting to really long duration for a test suite to run, and it could be several hours or more. This is a challenge. This doesn't mean that the tests are necessarily bad, but it puts it dampens the cadence of your development cycle. You really have to, you're going to have to wait for every little change, or you can't make a little change and then run the test suite. Certainly not the whole test suite. So slow tests make it difficult to make changes to a site. Now, bad tests is a broader category, and it could encompass slow tests, but not necessarily. When I talk about bad tests, what I'm really talking about are tests that result in errors, that are failing maybe when they shouldn't be failing, or that test something spuriously. So, for example, you could have a test that just, hey, test this function that gets a value and just gets this other, and just test against this one other value. Okay, that's nice, but what happens when a different type of value is passed in? This isn't a statically typed language. Are you testing for different types of exceptions? Are you testing for different ranges of values? So that's not a meaningful test. So that's a bad test, or not a great test at the very least. So any of these latter three categories that you face mean it's difficult to work with your existing app. And in the case of the test suite with errors, that's something you're going to typically encounter as a new developer. You're onboarded to a project, or a client has a project, and no one's run the test suite for a while, and that's why. So that's the other thing is, of course, if you have a test suite with errors, it's not being run because it's got this high signal, or rather a low signal to noise ratio. So let's talk about fixes. The way to fix a test suite that doesn't have any tests is to add tests. Now, for a large application, this is non-trivial. So where do you start? The best advice I ever heard about this was to start with bugs. You don't start writing tests for everything in the code base. You start with bugs. You find a bug, you write a test case for it, you fix it, make sure the tests pass, and you go on from there. And as you touch new pieces of code, you write tests for this. Now, eventually, you're going to have pretty extensive test coverage, but you go in this stepwise manner, starting with bugs, new features, anything you touch, and that's the way you can do this in a manner that's not overwhelming and doesn't stop feature development. As far as slow tests go, there's a number of things you can do, and it's going to depend on why the tests are slow. Tests could be slow because the underlying code is slow, and if you can speed that up, that goes a great deal to speeding up the tests. If you're making too much use of the database in ways you don't need to, for example, not using select related or fetch prefetch calls, and if you're not mocking services, so if you could have tests that are actually making calls to third-party systems that are unit tests that are making calls to database when they don't need to. There's all kinds of things you can do there to speed these tests up. Not saving model instances if you don't need to. Use mocks. And there are solutions too if you do need to use the database. You can make sure you're using a test runner that's going to be not dropping the database so that you don't have to recreate the database every single time. And again, this is going to really be scenario specific as far as how you solve for slow tests. Now, bad tests are a different ball game. Again, I mentioned this low signal to noise ratio. The point of tests is to provide you with information. That's the point. And the information that a test should provide you is some sort of indication whether something is broken or not. It's going to provide you with information of a sort of a confidence level that the code is correct, that your application works right. So if you have bad tests, if there's errors in the tests, those are bad. That is pure noise. It's not signal. So the solution here is to quiet these. Get rid of the tests. Take every test that has an error that doesn't pass because let's start with the error that has an error and doesn't pass because of an error, and silence it. Don't delete it, just skip it. You add the skip decorator if you're using unit test, the same thing from PyTest, and come back to these. So you want to make sure you have a test suite that's healthy, that's running, and then come back to these kind of on a one-by-one basis and start to look at where the errors are. You might find that the errors are in the code base, and that's significant, but if the errors are in the test suite, then you can slowly start going through and figuring out where are the errors in the test suite, how can I fix these, and how can I start making the rest of the test suite healthy again. Again, it's an iterative process, and if you have tests, the same thing with tests that are failing where they really shouldn't be. Where is a test failing that it shouldn't be, you ask? Great question. The way this can happen is if developers were making changes to the features and they weren't keeping up with tests. There was no test-driven development at all. They weren't running the tests, and so someone wasn't running the tests. They were making changes to the feature set, and now there's a mismatch between the tests and the application code. So again, same thing with those tests. You want to silence those and come back to them on a one-by-one basis. And with tests like that, you probably just want to, again, fix the issue and get it to the point where your entire test suite runs with all the tests passing in a reasonable amount of time.